Good morning and welcome everyone to Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development CropTalk webinar. If you have any questions during this presentation today, please type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar menu and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. I'd like to welcome everybody to the May 6th edition of CropTalk. And this week we're going to be looking at some of those areas that are almost a nemesis to a lot of producers. They just seem to be areas we spend a lot of money on and don't seem to get a lot out. But it's just something that we just keep doing every year. So I thought it'd be good to get Marla on this week. Marla is our land management specialist, and get her to talk a little bit about how we can maybe get the most out of those areas instead of continually just pumping money into them and not really getting anything out. Then after that, we're going to have our first edition of our crop scouting panel, and we've got a few questions that have been sent in. And if you've got questions as the presentation is going on for the members of the panel, just type them in and we'll try to answer them before the end of the broadcast today. So with that, I put this slide up just to remind everybody that this is what it looked like last year on May the 5th. You can see in the background the little bit of a tractor and an air seeder there, and it was so yesterday was a snow day last year. So some producers are getting a little bit worried because we're into May and they haven't started doing anything yet. Well, last year we were, we had crop in at this time, but we still had some pretty lousy days between that crop coming up. So maybe the way the weather's been going and maybe keeping us out of the field is maybe a little bit of a blessing. Maybe we'll get that soil temperature up and we'll get the crop growing faster this year. So a little bit of an update. Again, little or no rainfall over the past week, which I think a lot of producers are looking for. We can hold off till we get the crop in before we get any kind of major rainfall would be great. We're making good progress with harvest, but it actually is slowing down here over the last 3 to 4 days. A lot of the frost is starting to come out of the ground, and a lot of those fields are starting to get wet and soft, so it's getting a little bit harder to travel on those fields. So some producers are put in a situation, even with the harvest, they're going to have to wait a bit just for the ground to dry so they can get back out there and finish. But overall, there has been a fair bit done over the last week to 10 days. With the cool temperatures, the forage and grass is off to a slow start, and I think this is something that's affecting quite a few of our livestock producers. And I guess the caution is to try to hold off grazing as long as you can, because it's definitely going to affect the way the pasture is going to grow throughout the coming year. If you've got some pastures that you can use that are your, where you don't have to go back again to, then yeah, you could probably throw them out on there. But I think there's not a lot of grass being out there yet, so you're going to probably still have to do some supplemental feeding. Some seeding has begun. So we've had, especially in the southwest here, we've had areas that warmed up a little bit quicker, maybe didn't receive as much rainfall last fall. In the Verdon area and south of rivers, there was guys going for the last 2 to 3 days here, and even yesterday afternoon I was seeing some random dry fields throughout the whole southwest here where guys were picking and choosing and getting on there and actually getting some crop in. Most guys are still telling me it's still too wet, and they hope by the end of the week here they'll be out. And if the only problem right now is forecast still has for cool temperatures, so it's not going to warm up a whole bunch. Soil temperature is our big concern right now. We can definitely get the crop in the ground, but make sure you're sowing crops that can germinate under cool conditions. We're looking at averages from anywhere from 3 to 8 degrees Celsius. And if you look on the right side of the screen there's yesterday's averages of soil temperatures for most like generally throughout the province. So you look at that and we're definitely in that 5 to 6 degrees Celsius. So peas and cereal crops can be going in the ground. They're probably still going to germinate fairly slowly because we're probably going to see some temperatures, or the way the forecast is talking, where we're going to see some cool temperatures and cool evenings, which are going to slow things down. Producers are still trying to get out and get rid of last fall's problems and the wet conditions, and some areas, I know down into that Deloraine area and Boisvane area, things are still fairly wet, and a lot of those low areas, areas that tend to have water on them for longer periods of time, are still going to be problems, and usually those low areas tend to turn out to be our problem areas that I think we're going to get Marla to talk about today, and maybe we can get some advice as to how to handle some of those low areas or saline type areas. So I guess with that, we will turn it over to Marla and Laurie and start with their presentation.
Do you see my screen?
You bet.
Awesome. All right. Well, good morning on this cool in St. Malo, Manitoba, slightly sunny morning. And yeah, we're going to talk a bit about managing salt-affected areas in the field. And after, when we get to the panel, if there's any interest or discussion around some compaction and other wet area soil issues, we may get to that as well, just to talk about that further. So today, again, if anybody's listened to me give this salinity presentation, some of this you're going to have heard before. I did try to restructure this talk a little bit, apart from the way that I've been giving the talk in the last, through this kind of last couple of winters for extension. But again, we do need to start by mentioning and talking about this, because this is the basis for everything that we discuss around salinity. It is not a salt problem. It is always considered a water problem. And so when we start talking about solutions or way to manage salinity, we have to think about it as being a water problem and managed for the water, not managed for the salt. And that will come up when we talk a little bit. I will touch on some soil amendments and other issues later on in the. So in terms of the mechanics of soil salinity, because it's a water problem, when you have drying at the soil surface, that actually encourages more water to move upwards from below through that capillary rise or drawing of water from a high water table up to the soil surface. That is where the salinity comes from. It's always coming from down below. So salts can be drawn up in this process. And then as the soil dries, either through evaporation or transpiration through the plant, you get more moisture up from below, which means more salts come from below. So again, the drying isn't just from evaporation from the soil surface, it's also from crop water use, which allows for that shift for dry soil to encourage more moisture coming from below. And it is only once we have precipitation that falls in excess of the amount of evapotranspiration that's occurring will we actually have salts that leach downward. So what that looks like is here. When we're looking at dry years, our water table is very low in the soil profile. You get that capillary rise or wicking upwards, but if the water table is deep, you don't actually get it drawing up high enough to affect the root zone. As you get some more wet years, and we've seen this with years where we have excessive precipitation, that water table comes up from below. That has actually benefited us in a few dry years where we've had deep water table or high water table, which has actually allowed for that capillary rise to feed a crop in a dry year. But in doing so, it's also bringing more salts up. So what we see is in the dry years following a wet cycle, now that water table is in the realm of allowing those salts to come up into the root zone. And after a few more years of dry, that water table falls away, some of those salts behind, but as you start they start washing the salts down and you go through the cycle all over again. So in terms of the salinity trend, I just wanted to show this because this comes from AgVise and the work that they do. They will end up putting all of their soil test data together. And they've done this for Grand Forks, Winkler, and Brandon. And just to show that, yes, you get these in these saline kind of ups and downs, which follows a lot of the water or the precipitation that we've had over the years. So if you're going to have a problem with salinity, you have to have a high water table, and that can be within 6 feet of the surface on a clay soil. Les Henry uses a rule of thumb that once you're at field capacity or the maximum amount of water that a soil can hold, if you get 1 inch of rain, that can actually bring the salt or bring the water up in this clay soil a foot from where it had been. So 1 inch of rain can increase that water table depth or bring that saturation point up 1 foot. And so again, it doesn't take much in a clay soil to draw those salts up because that water can actually affect a fair bit above that field capacity area or saturation area. And then you also need evaporation that exceeds infiltration. So again, you need a period of time where you have more upward movement of water than you have downward movement of water. And then you have to have a plant that is susceptible to soil salinity. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a second. But before we move away from kind of the mechanics of soil salinity, I do want to talk about the 3 different times or types of salinity we end up seeing. Side hill seep is not super common in Manitoba in terms of a mechanism of salinity. But again, what's happening here is you have this impermeable layer or an area. This could be a till layer. This could be a very compacted kind of clay layer, something that doesn't allow water to move down into that profile. So where you have moisture, it's actually moving along that impermeable layer. And where you water table come close to the soil surface, this is where you end up with that salinity showing up. Not as common as we see in Manitoba, things like bathtub ring salinity. This is really common in Western Manitoba as part of pothole country or prairie pothole country. You have this low line, which is filled with point. What happens is water is actually moving in a more lateral way, and area around the slough has a higher rate of evapotranspiration, either because it's bare soil that is allowing for evaporation from it, or there may be crop growing around that slough area that is actually drawing up water. Drying this causes that movement of water into that dry zone, and it drags those salts along with it. So again, that is kind of the general mechanism of how you see bathtub ring salinity happen. This is also the same type of mechanism that we see with roadside salinity. So if you can imagine this to be a ditch that has water in it occasionally, now you only have water moving in one direction because the other direction closed off as it's compacted by the roadbed. So again, water is moving towards where the soil has through evapotranspiration, and it's drawing salts along with it. The other one is regional salinity. This is actually a major driver of salinity in Manitoba. And it's not something that we see as a big, we don't necessarily kind of see this in an immediate form, the way that we see that immediate kind of small area around a pothole and can imagine it. This is something where the entire landscape is part of basically the increased risk of salinity based on where we are in the landscape. So in general, at the top area here, this is what we consider a non-saline area or a recharge zone. Here, where water falls, it's actually feeding the water. This might be in prairie pothole country, say above the escarpment, and you may still have small pockets of salinity in those areas around sloughs. But because this is more of a regional look at salinity, with falling down, that water is moving, driving the water table, and at lower lying bottom end, this is where there's a higher upward movement because this is where the water table comes closer to the soil surface. Now, Les Henry showed this at his presentation at the Agronomist Conference in 2012. And this is a very kind of general map, but again, it's looking at this idea of where that water, what is the piezometer level or the level of water and where it's showing in the soil profile in Manitoba. And you see that at these lower lying regions where you might have higher risk of salinity because that water table is coming closer to the soil surface. You have areas here where you actually, the water table where it shows being above the soil surface, that may be areas that are marshy or kind of where there's actual water lying, but it also can be where you have springs, where you have water, upward water movement. So this is where we'd have things like flowing wells showing up. And again, that's that water head pushing up because that's where the water wants to go in that landscape. So again, we have a number of ways that salinity show up in the landscape, whether it's kind of the smaller regional areas like the prairie pothole country, or whether it's larger on the kind of grand scheme of things. If you look at a salinity risk map, we actually show that a lot of the Red River Valley is actually in a higher risk of salinity. It doesn't necessarily mean that we see high amounts of salinity across the Red River Valley, but the risk is there based on the way that that water moves under the ground across that landscape in Manitoba. The other thing, again, with a clay soil like we see in the valley, there is generally more upward movement of that water because of that clay. So there's a higher risk of the capillary rise as well, bringing those salts up to the surface. So when I talk about conditions that are required to a salinity problem, sorry, I just have to turn my pointer off so I can close this. There we go. So if you have a problem, you really are looking at a problem where the crop is actually vulnerable. And because we often talk about, oh, you've got salts, you know, they're coming upwards, it's a salinity problem. Well, it's only a salinity problem if the salts are actually reducing crop growth or plant growth and reducing yield. And so we actually define the severity of a salinity problem by the crop. The tolerance, the crop damage, the yield loss, all of this is basically how we would define how bad a salinity. So if you look at a field like this, salinity problem looks very bad based on the crop that is growing here. There's large pockets of area where the crop is severely affected by salinity, but this is a very sensitive crop. So if you compared this or grew something like wheat on this field, you may not categorize or classify this soil as being a very severely saline soil. So here the salinity is defined by the risk associated with growing a pulse crop on that field. Same here, you've got a large area. Again, I'm sure you've heard me say this before, but where you see the effect of salinity on a crop, where you don't necessarily see that there's a lot of white salts at the soil surface, it's actually the crop is dying due to drought because the presence of the salt in the soil doesn't allow the water to move from the soil into the root. And so the crop dies due to drought where there's adequate soil moisture. That's a key indicator of a potential salinity problem. And quite often, crops that are less or more susceptible to salinity are also crops that are more susceptible to drought conditions. That generally goes together. NDSU has done some work looking at the actual salinity effect on crops. And so you've seen this before, looking at the lab test or what is your one-to-one soil test, you can actually gauge, looking at a map or graph like this, what potential yield loss you are going to experience at these different levels of salinity. So once you get into a salinity level of 1 to 2 decisiemens per meter or an electrical conductivity on your soil test within that realm of 1 to 2, this is where for crops like soybeans and corn, you are very quickly going to have yield loss. And that yield will drop very fast as it increases beyond that 1 to 2 on that electrical conductivity scale. Whereas crops like wheat, barley, canola, which is not on this graph, but very similar to wheat and barley in that case, They are much more tolerant. They will give you 100% yield through those increasing levels of salinity. And when you actually hit their tipping point, the curve is a lot more gradual when they actually start to lose yield as that salinity continues to increase. But these are general statements about a crop. When we look at varieties, there are differences in varieties. In Swift Current, they actually have the salt lab where they've done a lot of work looking at responses of different crops. So this is some older data, but I just wanted to show you in general in terms of some wheat varieties, what this looks like in different cultivars. They all have different curves or different points at which they would actually respond and hit that tipping point. Some are much more sensitive than others. So when NDSU puts together a graph like that, or anyone puts together a graph looking at one crop type, there's a lot of variation within the varieties. And it'll be interesting to see as we have more like newer varieties developed, whether or not there is more salinity tolerance that comes along with some of that crop vigor that we're really looking at identifying with new varieties. So we know that the crop is affected. We need to know exactly how bad the salinity is in order to make decisions on how we are going to apply this knowledge or how we are going to manage the salinity within the field. So what we want to do is take a measure of electrical conductivity. Again, electrical conductivity is not a direct measure of soluble salts, it's an indirect measure. It's just a way of figuring out what proportion of salts may exist in the soil. Depending on which lab you send your sample to, they will list it as electrical conductivity or soluble salts. They will have units of decisiemens per meter, millisiemens per centimeter, or millimos per centimeter. Does not matter what the unit is, all of them are equal. But there is a difference in how the analysis is done in the lab, and I am going to repeat that in the next slide because I know everyone's heard me talk about it, but it is very important, especially as we get more in this presentation looking at crop tolerance. Very important to understand that there's a difference between the way that a researcher will assess soil salinity and the way that the lab will do it for you as a producer. So soil sampling, we always do 0 to 6 and 6 to 24. I want to know the salinity level on both of those depths because salts are coming from below. So quite often you can see whether or not those salts are rising at the deeper depths, and that can be very important. The other thing that we can do is we can map salinity using an EM38 or a Veris. We need to make sure that the calibration of this is done because soil samples need to be taken at different points throughout the field to verify why the number changed or the reading changed on the EM38. So you have an EM38 or a Veris, it just gives you a number. It's not saying at this exact location, you have a salinity level of X. It's just giving you a reading. And the electrical conductivity reading changes due to water content, changes due to clay content, as well as salt content. And so you need to factor out things like changes in moisture and clay content in order to figure out whether it's actually changing due to salt. And so it's very important for a lot of soil samples to be taken in order to prepare that map. And again, the map is only really giving you the information for that year because again, the salinity will fluctuate, but it does give you an indication of where the poor areas are that have a higher risk of salinity. It doesn't mean that that saline level will be exactly that level, you know, in 2020, 2021, and 22, because they are going to change over time. So in terms of the analysis that's actually carried out in the lab, what happens is a researcher or soil survey, if you've looked at soil survey data, they will have numbers that will differ from the ones that you have on your soil test. And that's because they use something called the saturated paste method. Saturated paste is taking a certain volume of soil and adding just enough water to it to make a slurry, placing that slurry in a filter, drawing that water off of that slurry through suction through the filter, and then analyzing the electrical conductivity of the water that was drawn off of that slurry. What happens is that is giving a more accurate reading of what the root is actually experiencing in the soil. It's not necessarily a better test than the commercial test that we run, but it is slightly more accurate just in that it's giving a higher reading based on that concentration of salt in that root zone. It's more expensive to run this test. It takes a much longer time in order to actually, draw off the water. And so the soil survey lab may do this, but a commercial testing lab is actually going to do a 1-to-1 soil to water ratio, sometimes a 1-to-2 soil to water ratio. They will take, 15 grams of soil, 15 milliliters of water, mix them together really well, and let them settle for a bit, stick a probe in, take the reading. It's very quick, it doesn't cost very much, but the reading that this method gets will be approximately 1/2 of that of the saturated paste method. I say approximately because it does depend on the soil salinity rate or the soil texture, sorry. So if you look here at this slide, the bottom, this is those zones we often talk about. So non-saline, slightly saline, moderately saline, severely, and very severely. And at the bottom, this is looking at the saturated paste method. So if you were looking at a soil survey or crop tolerance level, they will be placing the crops in these specific categories. But the actual soil test that you would get on your soil, let's say you are in a moderately saline area on a sand, you will be somewhere between 1.6 and 3.0 in terms of what your soil test salinity would be to be considered moderately saline, compared to 4 to 8 on that saturated paste. If you were on a clay, it would be between 2.3 and 4.4. So there's a difference in terms of how this approximately 1/2 is applied based on soil texture. So I just wanted to identify that. And if you have more questions about that, always contact me and let me know. We know we have a problem. We have identified that we may have areas or regions in a field that have to be managed differently than the rest of the field, or we have entire fields that have higher salinity risk in general. We identify the problem, we soil test, we figure out we need to cope with it. How are we going to do that? Well, we need to think back on how that salinity happens. High water table, drawing capillary salt or soluble salt up through that capillary action. We have a drier period in terms of having more evaporation or transpiration of water out of the soil profile than you have actual precipitation that's infiltrating or leaching salts back down. So you have that increased upward movement, and you have a crop that is susceptible to salinity. So maybe you're trying to grow things like soybeans and corn on these fields. And so this is now how you're going to look forward in terms of what your best management strategy will be. So the first thing that you can do in terms of managing salinity is look at those yield maps, look at the EM38 maps, look at a soil map. You can look at all sorts of information. As you gather that information, but your yield map or your knowledge of how the crop grows or doesn't grow in this case, across the field, this is how you are going to define the poor growing areas, and then you're actually going to figure out whether it's salinity that's actually causing that problem. So you're going to look at those yield maps and you're going to say, this is an issue. These areas are not providing or not performing properly year after year. The first thing that I want you to do is stop wasting money on these points in the field. Because what happens is year after year, we put crop in, we put fertilizer down, and we don't actually think about the fact that if these areas are not doing well and are not actually providing yield, we're wasting money on these regions as opposed to investing in them. And so I want you to stop spending money on them first. And I want to actually go in and investigate a little bit more about how saline they are, how bad are they, do some soil testing in those areas. And then once you've got that information, you can actually look at investing in those areas or planning for future cropping strategies for those regions. If you're doing variable rate technology, you probably are already factoring these areas out and changing how you manage them. But even if you're not in a situation where you're taking grid samples or zone samples, you're not actually doing variable rate, you could just simply crop those areas and turn the fertilizer off. So again, stop wasting money in these regions, and now let's look at how we're actually going to promote investment. The other thing that I don't want you to do, along with wasting money in them, is eliminate tillage, do not till. If you do nothing, do nothing. It means don't till those areas. And I know that there is often an urge to till or spray out those areas because they are weedy and they are filled with things like kochia and stuff we do not want to deal with. But the act of actually tilling will encourage further evaporation, bringing more salts up. And that can be a problem in terms of that increase in the salinity. So all you're doing is making it worse when we're actually going out and tilling those areas. A lot of times people talk about deep tillage because they're worried that if that area is compacted, and sometimes those low-lying areas also are compacted, which means you don't have downward movement of water. So even if you wanted and had excessive precipitation, those salts would never be able to leach down anyway because the compaction of the soil is actually decreasing downward movement of water. Deep tillage or subsoiling may, and I want to stress may, break up that hard pan and allow for downward movement of water, but it can also increase the salt uprising or the rising of salt through that soil profile. So you have to consider the fact that there are a couple of different issues here, and I've seen it sometimes work and I've seen it a lot of times not work too. So deep tillage, yeah, it could allow for that hard pan to break up to allow for more downward movement of water, but it also then allows for more upward movement of water. So it's kind of a 50-50 shot here and maybe not worth doing. Where we're dealing with more moderately salt affected land, this is where we want to look at your crop rotation and choose what's best suited to your soil. Use crops that draw down water, looking at crops that like alfalfa. Looking at the graph here, alfalfa will help dry out the soil, and by drying out the soil, it again allows for more downward movement of water when you get that excessive precipitation, and that can actually help to draw down that water table and move those salts over time back down deeper into the soil profile. You can also look at these salt tolerance levels that come from the soil management guide. And this information is provided in a number of different locations. Saskatchewan also has these similar types of charts. Again, when you look at a chart like this, you have to consider the fact that all of those crop tolerance levels are based on saturated paste tests for salinity. So you have to take those numbers and divide them by 2 in order to compare them to your lab test. Again, I showed this graph already looking at NDSU's crop tolerance information. So as you see, you can choose crops if you know that you are down in this level, and oops, sorry, I forgot that this is the saturated paste number because it's research. So I have to divide all those numbers by 2 in order to compare them for you. You're going to look at your crop level, and if you are at an EC of 5, which is not uncommon in a lot of fields, you are going to have, potentially 10% crop loss just due to the salinity alone, even in the more tolerant crops. But that's something that we have to then look at and work with. I do want to also mention that NDSU also has something called a salinity economics tool, and I'm looking at whether or not we can take this or develop something similar, looking at our economics here in Manitoba, because obviously this is based on kind of US numbers, the US dollar, also looking at US land prices and such. But what happens is they looked at these exact little tipping points, or those curves they showed in the last graph. And you can actually choose, when you enter into this graph, you can choose the salinity that your soil test is. You can put in your price of nitrogen. If you have an N credit that you want to factor in, that can go in, and you can adjust the price for, they only have corn, soybeans, and wheat, and in this case for their NDSU tool. And what that does is it actually will show you where your cash returns and your returns to labor are going to be in terms of whether or not the crop that you are growing is actually going to be as economical to you based on the salinity level. So it's kind of an interesting tool, and I'm hoping that maybe we can develop something like this for Manitoba. There's also information on crop tolerance index. Now, I do not expect you to get a lot out of this graph because I even get confused by it. But what this is, and this is information, a lot of it coming from research out of the salt lab in Swift Current, where they've actually taken different crops, and what they do is they have this C50. This is actually the point at which 50% of the yield has been reduced due to salinity, and this is the salinity level that is required to cause that 50% yield reduction. Now remember, this is research, so therefore this is saturated paste numbers, but I couldn't just divide them and make it work properly because the calculations for the salinity tolerance index doesn't quite work if you actually just divide them out at this point. So I have to keep it in the saturated paste numbers. But just as you can see, crops like corn, much lower in terms of its salinity tolerance. Things like AC saltlander, which is a salt tolerance green wheatgrass, and kochia, they have very high salt tolerance. And it means that they actually can withstand a lot more salt in the soil. And that can actually affect then the point at which it actually can produce 50% yield or 50% seed in this case. And so you can actually from here do a calculation. Well, if I can only tolerate 10% crop yield reduction, then what would that salinity level be that I could grow barley at or canola at? So there are calculations that can be done with this, and I can always help people through that if you're trying to use this type of information. So crops, we can make decisions on crop management. We can make decisions on tile drainage because people talk quite often about tile drainage. Tile drainage does lower the water table. And if a high water table is the problem, having that control over the water table can then allow you to potentially reclaim a saline soil. But I do want to put this into perspective. You have to have precipitation that's in excess of evapotranspiration in order for water to leach through the profile. If the tile doesn't run, it's not leaching out salts. It's easiest to control this under irrigation. Sometimes though, you also have a tile that's running, but it's not actually from upward, like above water, it's actually from below that's draining water out. So we need to factor that in as well. But you have to have high precipitation rates in order to actually have that salt leach down out through that tile. AgVise has done work looking at the soil tests, salinity levels under tile drainage, and after 9 years, they were able to move from this dotted red line down to this solid red line, and that looks quite significant. That is great. It did lower or lessen the salinity in the soil, but again, it dropped it from relatively low levels to begin with, and over a 9-year period. So again, if you're relying on Mother Nature to rain and have excess rainfall, to have that salt move through the profile, that's something we need to consider. It's not a quick fix at all to reclaim soils through tile drainage when you don't have irrigation to control that. So what we're doing right now is we're really focusing on these areas of the soil. We're not focusing on these other areas. I also want to point out that when AgVise does their generalized soil information, they will do these maps based on different postal codes, and they're showing soils that have salinity above 1 decisiemens per meter. So these are soils that would start affecting crops like corn and soybeans. There are different regions in Manitoba and into Saskatchewan that show higher risk of salinity, but this is only based on the salinity or the soil tests that are sent in to the lab that are most likely sampling from this area of the soil. They're not necessarily sampling in this area of the soil. And so it may underrepresent how bad the salinity is because it's taking from the lesser saline areas, because we generally are not sampling this area when we're taking a composite sample in the field. We have areas that look like this. They're not always white soil surface. This still shows an extreme salinity problem. Kochia is extremely salt tolerant, as I showed in that slide looking at salt tolerance for different crops. What do? Do you spray it out or till it up? Probably not, because by doing that, we're just increasing that upward movement of water. We're not actually managing this area by spraying this kochia out, and definitely not managing it if we're going to till up these regions. So do we let it grow? Well, that might be something that we're worried about because we don't necessarily want a patch of kochia growing in the field. We mow it. Mowing it actually, or mowing weed patches or saline patches, actually a beneficial thing to do because you keep the crop in more of a vegetative state, which means it's going to draw out more moisture. And then when you have that excess precipitation, it can help to wash those salts deeper down because you're pushing or you're lowering the water table through the use of the transpiration of the crop. Mowing it could be beneficial. Do we harvest it? Do we feed it? Kochia can have quite good feed value, so bale it up and test it. It can have toxicity issues as well, so you do want to make sure that you're testing it, but it is possible to actually use this patch to your advantage while managing the spread of the kochia because you're managing it by keeping it from going to seed. And that I will let Tammy talk about because that is not my area. Using manures or mulch. So doing this can increase organic matter or water holding capacity of the soil, which actually improves the crop growth. And by improving the crop growth, you end up increasing the crop water uptake. So the organic matter or the mulch is not actually fixing the salinity because it's not affecting the water directly, but because it's increasing crop water uptake, that is then increasing the salinity or increasing the or decreasing the water table is what I'm trying to say. So lowering the water table through improved crop water uptake. You can actually also reduce the evaporation because you've kind of given a layer of protection over top of the soil, which can actually benefit the system. Again, looking back at bathtub ring salinity or imagining this as being roadside salinity, this is where if you grew something like alfalfa that is deep rooted along the edge of the field, that actually cuts off that lateral flow of water over to the soil profile by kind of taking up that water before it gets there. And that can actually remediate the area next to the field or next to the ditch that has become saline. There's often this little region right along the edge of the ditch where things grow okay. Use that lesser saline area or non-saline area to your advantage to put alfalfa in so that this larger patch that's into the field actually can leach out those salts over time. This is a long-term investment. It's not a fast, quick fix. But over time, those salts will leach out. And so you want to actually plant something that will use the water around the slough, around the wetland, or along the field edge, along those ditches. When I managed the zero-till farm years back, when the zero-till farm still existed, there were areas or wetlands there that had big areas of salinity around them. And there were some wetlands that had no salinity. The no salinity wetlands were the ones that had willows growing around them. And then finally, plant it to a salt tolerant forage. This information is provided from our website. There's different salinity levels that we can look at. If you have high levels of salinity, there's crops or forages that we can look at that can actually benefit those areas. Again, you have to compare them to your lab tests. So you take those numbers and divide them by 2. Things like AC Saltlander actually has decent yields in terms of as being this green wheatgrass that was developed out of Swift Current. It might not be as high as some other wheatgrasses, but it has extreme salt tolerance, and that can be very beneficial. Forage crops for saline soils, you want to have a mix of standard grasses, legumes, and salt-tolerant grasses, which allows for a bit more variability because the salinity isn't always high in every little spot. And so by doing this, you have a better kind of blend in general to allow for certain grasses or legumes to take in one area or another. And just to quickly wrap up, soil amendments, be skeptical of quick fixes. These things only fix salinity in the imagination because they're not affecting water. I do want to point, there's a couple of different research projects where they actually have looked at some of these products. Dave Franzen had looked at soil surfactants as well as gypsum and sugar beet spent lime and did not find any benefit in terms of salinity reduction. The soil surfactant is often marketed as something that allows for more water to move down through the soil, which is why they say that it will affect salinity. But not something that they have actually seen in terms of that decrease of salinity in the. There's also, if anyone's heard of trichoderma, so this is bacteria, fungi that gets added to the soil that's supposed to improve or infect the crop root and improve crop growth. There have been some benefits shown only under stress conditions to increase yield, but this has only been done in greenhouse work, not been seen in field work. So we have no idea whether or not something like this as an inoculant could actually be beneficial. Humic acids, again, there's been some positive results using humic acid in a controlled greenhouse environment, not been seen in field conditions. But again, these products are increasing crop growth. They're not fixing salinity because they're not fixing the water problem. So they're basically something that may limp you through a salinity problem, but not actually. So again, to prevent it, you want to annually soil test so you know where it's coming from, reduce tillage, improve your drainage if you can, have high water using crops in your rotation, make sure your organic matter is staying higher because that can help buffer the problem over time, and establish forages either in buffer strips that are needed or in those highly saline soils that aren't fit for annual crop. When all else fails, sell it, but as Les Henry always says, sell it in the wintertime because you can't tell if it's white in the summer either. So with that, thank you very much. If anybody wants to talk to me further or ask any questions, you know how to track me down, and I'll take questions if we've got, or we can move into the panel.
Okay, thanks, Marla. I did have one question come through regarding adding manure for organic matter, but you covered that one. So okay. I think what we'll do then is, Flory, if you want to return the screen to me, we'll get back to the panel. I think, Marla, there might be a question for you on that as well. So show my screen and let's get to the panel. So last week we talked about introducing the crop scouting panel, and here are the members of the panel. And we did get some questions come in from the past week. And what we're going to do is we'll go through the questions and get the answers out to you. So I think the first one is to Ann Kirk. And if I'm planting in current conditions, should I be finding out what my seed vigor is, or as long as my germination is good, am I okay?
So for the planting now, the concern would be the cold soil temperature. So the vigor test is typically done at 5 degrees Celsius, so it's a good indication of how your seed will germinate in cold weather. The issue is like, say you're looking at cereal seed, the seed vigor test would actually be done for almost 14 days or 12 days. So it would take quite a bit of time to actually get your results back, and people would probably want to be seeding before then. So I think that as long as the seed quality is good and there's no concerns with sprouting, so if the seed that was harvested, if there's concerns from sprouting from last fall, then I would be more concerned and would be looking at a vigor test. But if the seed quality is good and was harvested under good conditions, I think it would be okay just to stick with the germination. For seed vigor, it would typically be better to do it, earlier in April to actually get a good feel for how it would germinate under cold conditions.
Okay, good. Thanks, Ann. We'll go to the next question. I think this one will be from Marla. I righted up my field with combining last fall and still have not been able to get on the field. So what yield losses might I expect in this area, and how do I fix it?
That is a good question. So we don't, unfortunately, have a lot of really good information on yield loss in rutted areas. Outside of a few small projects that I'm aware of out of Minnesota, this was specific to corn though. And what they found was in those rutted areas, they saw up to generally a 17% yield loss in the ruts versus the area outside of the ruts. And so to that effect, I am putting a plea out to anyone out there who has rutted areas and would like us to come out and do some investigation into the ruts versus the non-rutted areas. Would love to do a little bit of work looking at what that yield impact could be this year. In terms of how one of the things obviously that you're looking to do then is to till in those areas. There are some risks though of tilling obviously right now where the soil is wet. The rule of thumb is if it's too wet to plant, it's too wet to till, but the problem is we're trying to get those dealt with in such a timely manner so that we can get on to till or to plant. So where you are dealing with those rutted areas, if you are going to till shallow and only stick to those rutted areas. Try your best to direct seed in if you can. It's going to take a while for the soils that we have to dry down because the frost is still below, and until that frost is gone, the soils can't drain properly. And so those are kind of things to look at. Also, if you are going to go in and till those areas, if you can, try to drive where those ruts are, because then you're at least not compacting those rutted areas even further, because those ruts can be quite compacted down deep, and you don't want to make that worse.
Okay, thanks, Marla. Next question for Anne and John Hurt, I believe. I haven't been able to get any fertilizer on my winter wheat yet. Only put phosphate with seed last fall. Rained again yesterday. What leaf stage is winter wheat at, and how much time do I have before I start losing yield potential? Fields are wet and I have to make ruts, I will, or if I can wait, that's best.
I'll try this one first. So my thought, and it's based on some Manitoba data that they looked at in other areas, is that yes, we like to have the nitrogen out there early, especially if there's a weak stand that we need to encourage tillering. But when we look at yield loss in studies has not occurred until we start to get into late tillering and actually the stem first node there. So we actually have a wide window, but we still encourage people to get on there early, as long as they're not rutting up fields. The other thing, this fellow, I may get in trouble, fortunate enough to have rain yesterday. We've had some areas without much rain at all. And so if you're putting nitrogen on the surface, plant doesn't know it's there until we do get rain. So you may want to time it in anticipation of the next rain, or certainly be using a urease inhibitor to protect it if we're going to have that nitrogen sitting on the surface very long.
Okay, and I guess regarding the leaf stage, I guess it's going to be variable depending on when it was planted last fall and what type of emergency got last fall and how it overwintered, I guess.
Just another comment. I know that many farmers are now applying a bit more nitrogen in the fall, and really what that helps to do is keep this spring window a little wider, so it does give some flexibility on how soon they can get on, and so they don't need to be the first ones out on the field. They've got a bit more wiggle room if they've got a portion of that nitrogen on in the fall.
Okay, thanks, John. John, I guess this one's again for you. How wet can it be to still put on NH3 effectively? If you have white clouds coming from each shank, am I losing product?
Well, the white clouds are water vapor forming on the cool gas. It's not always ammonia that you're losing. So you've got to go and probably sit on the ground behind there and sniff. And if you're still getting quite a bit of ammonia, then it's an issue. And it's not too wet to hold the ammonia. The problem is the sealing of those slots. And basically it means is that you're either your slots are remaining open, or you're smearing the sides of those slots and then lacking some type of closing over top of there. So, you know, the recommendations might be if you can reduce travel speed, it may allow a bit more time for soil flow. Check those shanks, because the ammonia may cause the moist soil to freeze on the opener because of that cooling effect. So make sure that you aren't getting a big shank because of the frozen soil on the sides. Suggestion is always to place it deeper, which people don't want to do because the soil is too wet at depth. The other would be to put some type of closing devices on there, or if you're pre-plant banding, you should be harrowing or packing or something to close that furrow. And they don't want to hear this, but wait until the soils are a little drier. That would or should allow better closure and sealing. Or put on a portion of the nitrogen this way and follow up with the remainder later. So there's lots of things you may wish to try. Bottom line is maybe some people, if they pre-bought ammonia last fall, a lot of people are obliged to take ammonia this spring, and so they may be pushing it just a little faster than what soils are able to tolerate it, without doing a bit extra to get it sealed.
Yeah, and the comment that Marla made that if it's too wet to seed, it's too wet to probably put fertilizer on too. So probably not a bad comment there as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks, John. This one will be for Tammy Jones. Weed burn down control under such cool temperatures. Spelling mistake there. How well will the herbicide work, and are weeds hardening off at this, and will this affect my rates?
Okay, so lots of questions within that. I think one of the things that we need to remember is that the yield of and Harker and O'Donovan did this work a long time ago, but the yield effect of one weed emerging a week before the crop is equivalent to that of about 100 weeds emerging three weeks after the crop. So really it is better to get that pre-seed burn done and get those weeds under control. The other thing that has been mentioned several times already this morning is how cool the soil temperatures are. And for the germinating crop that's being seeded or planted, that's very impactful. But for those winter annuals and perennials that are already out there and acclimated, they're loving the sunshine and they don't care about those cool soil temperatures. So they'll be growing rapidly. And we do get better results when we have smaller weeds. So when we're talking about weeds hardening off, we certainly need to look at where our lows are in the middle of the night or early morning. And so for annual weeds, we're probably looking at -3 or -4 before we see too much hardening off and frost damage based on the conditions that we've had, that it's been pretty consistently similar temperatures day over day. Whereas if you're looking for those winter annuals and perennials to be hardened off, you're probably looking at like -8 or -10 degrees because they've been out there and growing in these conditions. So getting some kind of early weed control with lower efficacy is probably better than no control. And how do we do that? Well, one thing is to make sure that we're applying it on warm and sunny days, way better than cool and cloudy, because then your plants are actively growing. And we last week talked about it, the rules of thumb. For systemic herbicides, you probably need it to get to 8 degrees Celsius for at least a couple of hours and increasing for 1 or 2 days in a row before you want to use your glyphosates. If it's contact herbicides, you need to get into the double digits before you see a lot of biological activity and therefore herbicide activity. So what does that mean as far as rates? Don't cut them. If you're relying on glyphosate in a tank mix with something else so that you have multiple modes of effective action, you certainly want to make sure that you're using a very healthy dose of glyphosate. Look at your label, look at what weeds are control, and think about this being a little bit of a more challenging situation, and make sure that you're using an adequate rate for that. So 1/3 of a liter REL is probably not the way to go. Don't cut your rates, and make sure that your water volumes are adequate for whatever your add-in is with your glyphosate in that pre-seed burn tank mix.
Okay, and just got a text. What about residual herbicides with the cool soil temperatures, or any concerns there?
Well, the good news is that with the cool soil temperatures, those residual herbicides won't be breaking down as quickly. As long as there's adequate soil moisture and those plants are growing within that residual herbicide layer, then they will be taking up that herbicide and it should be effective on that weed. It's more of a challenge when we have dry soils and warm conditions and we see breakdown of the herbicide and no uptake by the weeds or no weeds germinating when that herbicide is active. So actually, I don't think that the cool temperatures are a real downgrade for the soil residuals. It probably means that they're going to help you out more. The only thing would be if it's something that needs a little bit of time to activate in the soil, it needs to vaporize or whatever that might be, it might take a little bit longer for that. And so any weeds that have germinated prior to activation will still continue to grow, but anything that germinates where that herbicide is active and is in soil solution and is taken up into that plant, it's going to do a great job.
Okay, thanks, Tammy. John Gavloski was doing some soil temps and found this in 2 to 4 inches of soil. What is it?
Okay, it's the pupa case of a noctuid moth of some sort. So noctuids, they're the group that include your cutworms, your Bertha armyworms, but they're a very big group of moths, and the pupa of that group tend to look very much alike. There's a lot of different species. It's very hard to go to species by just looking at the pupa from a noctuid. So potentially it could be a cutworm, potentially it could be Bertha armyworm, something in that grouping, but we really can't go any further than that with just the photo of the pupa case.
Okay, good. And this is my question I asked you yesterday. If you could comment on that. We're hearing a lot of this on the news right now.
Yeah, so Asian giant hornet, as the name would imply, it's from Asia. It's the biggest species of wasp in the world. And the concern that's out there is that in September, they did find a established colony of this wasp in the Nanaimo area on Vancouver Island. An entomologist on the island went out. They are quite confident they've destroyed that colony, but they, of course, will be keeping an eye on that. And subsequent to that, in December, in Washington State, they found a dead Asian giant hornet just south of the Canadian border. It is from a different colony than the one on Vancouver Island, so they were separate introductions. And so what's happened is Washington State has put out an alert just so people look for this hornet, and if they do see it, to call the proper people. That way, if by chance it is establishing, they can again try an eradication. It isn't something that right now seems to be actively spreading, so this is really blown out of proportion. There's a lot of media attention on this right now, but it's not something that's moving across Canada. It's something we certainly want to watch out for, but we're in no risk of it here right now. Where they're native to in Asia, they tend to do well in forest areas and low mountain areas. They do not do well in open plains, so I don't anticipate they would do well in the prairies, and they may not like our winters as well. So I don't think it's anything of a threat. If by chance anybody thinks they've seen one, they could give me a call. But do note that we've got things such as horntails and some larger wasp-like things here that would be easy to confuse with this.
Okay, thanks, John. And I guess that kind of completed the panel questions that we had for today. I'd like to thank the people that sent their questions in, and also just to give a shout out to everybody that if you have questions throughout the week, send them in and I'll give you the email addresses here later on in the presentation. But again, thank you, and I think it's something that we're getting a little bit of a response to, so we'll continue it again next week. Once again, field crop production guides are available at the offices, and so if you're needing one as we're getting into the busy season, stop by or call ahead and get one picked up. The crop reports have started. They were updated yesterday, and so if you're interested in the crop reports, the weather maps, all that information will be up. I think the insect and disease reports will be coming up later on today. And there's how you would go about signing up for them. Here's the extension specialist in Manitoba. So if you have questions, please feel free to contact any one of these people, and they'll be able to help you out. Join us next week, May the 13th. There's the email address for Lori for sending questions in as well. And there's our Manitoba Ag website. So thanks again for attending, and we'll see everybody May 13th.